let's get going. Welcome, everyone. I'm just getting used to how close I have to stand to this mic, so I'm trying not to create any feedback, but it'll take me a couple of seconds just to adjust where I am. Thank you for coming to the last session of the day with me. I hope everyone's had a great day. I've certainly heard lots and lots of interesting things, particularly as I don't work in HR. I'm a designer, and so I've heard lots of new and really interesting things. What you'll hear from me today is from my perspective as a designer. I'll tell you a little bit more about what I do and how that maybe, hopefully, intersects with some of the things that you do. But certainly while I'm talking today, what I invite you all to do what I'd like to do is hopefully send you out back into the world inspired. And I'd invite you all to kind of engage your imagination about what your workplace could look like with a few changes. Think about the possibilities for the future of your workplace as I talk this afternoon. So I'll start by introducing myself, and I'll introduce myself with a massive picture of my head. Why not? As if there is any other way. So my name's Paul Jervis Heath. I'm Chief Creative Officer and one of the founding partners of Modern Human. I've been a designer for 25 years. I have designed, in that time, I've designed just about everything. I've designed dashboards for autonomous vehicles. I've designed connected home appliances. I've designed, what else have I designed? I've designed intelligent retail environments. I've designed libraries. I've designed museum exhibits. I've designed a call center. And I've designed, certainly over the last 18 months, my fair share of workplaces as well. My role at Modern Human means that I look after all of our design research capability, our product design, our service design, and our environment design strategy. And of course, workplaces are one of the environments that we're invited into clients to design. I used to be head of innovation at Cambridge University, and I think I've probably spent my career trying to understand waves of change and understand how they impact people's everyday experiences. And it's fair to say that what we're witnessing at the moment is a massive wave of change that's impacting all of our everyday experiences. Modern Human's an award-winning multidisciplinary design practice and innovation consultancy. As I say, we design quite a broad variety of things from products and services to environments. In all of the work that we do, the core is trying to enrich modern life. What we're trying to do is empower and liberate people through design. And one of the most effective ways of doing that is giving them the right environment in which to work. Our clients include people like the BBC and Tesco and Sony and Volkswagen and Electrolux and University of Oxford, the University of Cambridge, and the United Nations are all kind of clients of ours. As I said this morning, for those of you who are at the VIP breakfast, I believe we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reinvent work. I believe we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to create a genuine discontinuity between what we thought of work and the assumptions we made about work before the pandemic and everything that work could be after the pandemic. I believe that in the future, historians are actually going to examine this period of time as one of the great cultural movements, probably the first great cultural movement of the 21st century, which means that the decisions that we are making now will be looked upon and judged by future generations. They will see how we all changed the course of humanity for the better in the return to the workplace, in our response to the pandemic, in what we choose to do about looking after the planet and our stewardship of the planet for future generations. And that's the opportunity right now. You know, we're writing history as we do things. Lots of people talk about this being an unprecedented time. And one of the benefits of living in an unprecedented time is that you're doing things that previous generations haven't done before, which means that you have an opportunity to rethink things. And I think that presents us with the opportunity to create an unprecedented increase in productivity. Now, if we think about previous shifts in productivity, they've often been at someone else's expense. But I think this time we can increase productivity whilst maximising employee well-being and maximising employee happiness. And I don't think those concepts are mutually exclusive. I don't think productivity has to come at the cost of well-being or happiness. And so the next step for me is about a resurgence, not simply a drift back to the way things were before the pandemic. If all we do is drift back to our pre-pandemic ways of working, then I can't help feel that we'll have all failed. And I think if we're going to pull this off, we're going to need to create better workplaces. And if we're going to create better workplaces, we need to do something differently. We need to think differently. We need to imagine a better version of work. And what that involves is realigning the culture and the practice and workplace to the mission of the organisations where we work. And I think there's an awful lot of organisations who are waking up to the importance of purpose. And it makes sense where an organisation has a unique purpose and a unique place in the world, that all of its processes and its culture and its workplace all follow that purpose. But we've got quite a mission ahead of us if we're going to rethink the workplace. If you look at the places where we've worked, even the places that we worked in March 2019, the layout of the office had not changed significantly since Victorian times. So what you see in the column of images on the far left there is a radio factory in the 1920s. In the second column, you can see a legal office in the 1930s. Look how dapper everyone looks in those. In the third column, you can see a typing pool in the 1950s. And in this final column, you can see an open plan office in 2000s. And you can see how people think that the open plan office is a recent invention. But if you look at all of these pictures, that legal office from the 1930s is an open plan office. It doesn't look that different. Apart from what people are wearing, people there are better dressed than here. But apart from that, you'd have trouble telling those apart. You'd think that the technological advances and the cultural advances of the 1960s or the 1980s would have had some form of impact on the layout of the office. But look, they still look like Victorian factories. You think about the nature of 21st century work. You think about how much knowledge work takes place in our offices nowadays. The jobs that people do here weren't even invented for that radio factory in the 1920s. Yet the office layout has been retained. There's been over 150 years that our workplaces have looked the same. And we all know, because the evidence has been published for a very long time, before the pandemic, that open plan workplaces are toxic to productivity. The detrimental effects of the open plan office on colleagues were well documented before the pandemic. Yet very little had been done. Look, very little had been done in 150 years to change them. And so as we return to the office, we need to fix the problems of the open plan office, because that's neither complicated nor expensive. You know, one of the reasons that open plan offices are hugely popular as in companies like them, is you can cram a lot of people into an open plan office. That doesn't make those people effective. That doesn't make that environment good for the jobs that people are doing. And so my problems with the hybrid model and the term hybrid are perhaps well documented. I think we need to really think about the type of hybrid we're trying to create. I think, there's a lot of talk still about the 3-2 model, people working from the office 3 days a week. How is working from the office, working from a suboptimal office, fewer days a week, the answer? It's not the answer, it's just less of a problem. That's the problem with the 3-2 hybrid model. You don't have a solution there. You have something that's less of a problem than working 5 days in the office. But the fundamental problem is still the office. That's the thing that still needs to change. And I think we need a better answer than simply working in the office 3 days a week and working from home 2 days a week. Let's think about how we get to that answer. So, first of all, we have to think about how the physical workspace connects to the employee experience, because it's not happening in isolation. If we think about the colleague experience, we always think of it as kind of made up of 3 elements. We think of the culture and practices of the organization, we think of the systems and tools that the organization uses, and we think of the physical workspace. And of course, wrapped around that is the mission of the organization, the purpose of the organization. What is that organization trying to do? Why does it exist in the world? And so, all of these elements should be designed directly to enable and support the purpose of that organization. And I'm sure that each one of you would consider your organization as being unique, the purpose of your organization as being unique, the colleague experience that you will want to create as being different to your closest competitor. You know, you would hope that you have a unique proposition against other people in your market from a colleague experience point of view. And so it's reasonable to assume that your office would look different too. So how do we go about creating the right physical workspace? As a designer, what you do, because we don't work in your organization, is we start by going deep undercover in our clients' organizations. Now, you're already, if you're designing the workplace for your organization, one step ahead of us, because you're already deep into your organization. The bit that you might need to do is step out of your everyday experience of your organization and try and understand other people's everyday experience of the organization. What we see quite often is that when people start thinking about workplace, they'll send out some surveys, you know, or they'll include some questions on their employee engagement survey. They'll perhaps run some focus groups with staff. The problem with that is that market research tells us an awful lot about opinions and perceptions, but it doesn't tell us, it doesn't help us to understand the things that people don't know to tell us and can't tell us. That actually, one of the things that a survey will never tell you is the answer to the questions you don't know to ask. And so what we do instead is we get out into the organization and we use design ethnography to really try and understand the lives of colleagues in that organization. And so here are a few techniques that you might use instead of focus groups and surveys. The first one's diary studies. What we will often do is we'll ask colleagues in an organization to keep a diary. Tell us about all the things you do in a week. Tell us about all the meetings you go to. Tell us about the things that you do that aren't meetings. Let's have a look at your calendar and walk through kind of last week's calendar and see what you've done over that week. You get a really good perception of what people really spend their time doing when you start looking at their activities. Because people forget about all of the little meetings that they go to, all of the things that they have to do at the last minute, all of the times where work gets squeezed into the last half an hour of the day because they've spent 8 hours on Teams calls or in meetings. And so you get to see that. We had a client recently who keeps getting the answer back on their employee engagement surveys that people have got too much workload to do, that their workload is too high. So there's a survey telling them what is happening. The problem is that it doesn't tell them whether their workload genuinely is too high, people's workload genuinely is too high, or whether the perception of workload is too high. The truth is it's probably both of those things, and it doesn't tell you how to separate those two things as confounding factors, whereas ethnography will do. It will let you get an objective view of what people's workload really looks like, and let you hear about their perceptions of their workload, things that drive their perceptions of their workload. Shadowing is one of the other methods we use. Shadowing is simply following people. The great thing when you work for the organization that you're designing for is it's really easy to follow people. You just say, if I buy you a coffee, can I follow you for the day? People will go, you want to follow me for a day? Are they downsizing? Is my job at risk? You have to reassure them, like, we're not trying to get rid of people. We're not trying to make sure that you're doing your job properly. It's actually because we want to find out what people need, what kind of workplaces they need and things like that. But shadowing is really, really effective. And you just take loads of notes about what they're doing. Talk to them about it as they kind of go about their day after meetings. Tell them what they thought the outcome of the meeting was. Follow up with them a week later about whether anybody's actually done anything about that outcome of that meeting that they had last week. Look at how people are managing work and synchronizing work. One of the things we notice in organizations is that organizations spend a lot of time statusing. That one of their behaviors is that organizations, and this is true globally, people spend a lot of time telling each other what the status of work is, and they spend so much time doing that there's very little time left to actually move the status of the work on. And you see that from doing these types of studies. At the very least, what we would recommend is that you do some contextual interviews. Interview colleagues at their desk. Go and sit next to them where they work, ideally, if you can, and interview them about the job that they do. What are their pain points? What are the things that are difficult? How does the workplace feed into that? The physical workplace feed into that? You find an awful lot more out by doing these, because the key thing here is you're getting contextual information about the questions you don't even know to ask. A survey, you only ever get answers to the questions that you've asked, whereas with ethnography, you're constantly discovering things that you wouldn't have even known to ask at the beginning. And that's hugely powerful and hugely rich. When we go out, we're looking for 4 things. We're looking for workarounds. So workarounds are really good indications of a problem. They're a symptom. People will tell you all day about the workarounds that they've got. You actually see them when you're doing a contextual interview. You see them instantly the moment you sit down at their desk. It's the fact that they've got their username and password on a post-it note underneath their monitor. There's a workaround. The fact that they've got something next to them that tells them what to do in certain situations, what the process for something, or the keystrokes that they have to press in order to get the system that they use all the time to do some magical task that they do all of the time. Those workarounds come through. The key thing about workarounds is that they describe a symptom. You really have to get underneath that workaround. What's genuinely causing that? Because if you fix the symptom, you don't cure the problem. You only ever move the problem on. Whereas if you look underneath that workaround, you can quite often it's like unraveling a thread, and you kind of pull at the jumper and then you realize that it's kind of all connected, and then you have to work out how you solve the morass of wool that you've currently got and knit a new jumper. You've got values. Values come out when you talk to people. It's really hard to gauge what really is important to people on a survey, because they're choosing what you've told them. Select the things that are important to you out of these 7 things that we've said ought to be important to you. Whereas when you sit down and you talk to them individually, then you start to learn about what do people value and what's important to them. Most importantly, you get to work out what's not important to them, what's not worth investing in, what's not worth changing. You see inertia. Companies are full of inertia. This is situations in which people act out of habit. You think about all the things that people do on a daily basis. There's an awful lot of inertia in organizations. Change is difficult because of it. And one of the reasons you're interested in it is as a change maker, as a designer who's going to create something different. How do you leverage that inertia? How do you use people's habits to make something feel familiar? Or how do you break that inertia to encourage them to do something new? One of the most powerful things you see through ethnography is the difference between should and want. People all the time struggle with the tension between the things they crave in the moment and the things they know are good for them. And so this is all about how can we move people from where they are to where they want to be and align the things they know they ought to be doing to their values. And what we've seen with people's approach to hybrid working from the early ethnography that we've been doing with companies that have kind of instituted hybrid working so far is that one of the biggest sources for how people, or one of the biggest deciders for how people try and approach their work-life balance is whether they are looking to integrate work and life or whether they're looking to separate work and life. So some people, they want to integrate work and life. They want to try and create the optimum balance of work and life by blending the two together. So these are the people who might leave work at 3 o'clock, pick the kids up from school, but then log in later to check emails and finish off emails and get a document out that they've done. They don't mind doing that because they like integrating work and life. I can work anywhere, therefore I can be flexible about when I work to suit me and suit what I've got to get done, is the kind of attitude that integrators have. Separators, very different viewpoint. Separators try and carve out very distinct times for kind of work and non-work. So they try to keep the two things very separate. They think it's only fair to colleagues and to their family to focus on where they are there. So, you know, if they're out of work, they're going to focus on their family. If they're at work, they're going to focus on the thing that they should be doing at work. They keep them entirely kind of separate. Separators have very clear boundaries, and they're often very good at communicating those boundaries to others and helping others feel like they can create effective boundaries too. But some of the biggest contentions over hybrid work happen when you've got integrators and separators mixing in the workplace and not communicating about how they're trying to achieve their work-life balance. One of the biggest problems in workplace and how we design workplaces is that space is often planned in a waterfall way. You know, that actually you'll brief the facilities company or you'll brief the interior design agency, they create a plan, you iterate over the plan, and then they do the fit out and you get what was on the plan that you all agreed. The trouble is, what happens then when it doesn't quite meet your needs? What happens when actually the thing that you thought you needed wasn't really the thing that you needed after all? It's very difficult to iterate. We don't work like that because we found it doesn't work in the long term. Actually, we work with clients to conduct a series of experiments in space. So, for example, for a bank, they asked us, thinking about the future of hybrid working, what type of collaboration spaces would they need so that when people came into the office, they could work together effectively. You know, they were thinking about, are we going to have people hybrid meeting, where people are perhaps doing creative sessions with some people in the office and outside the office and all of those kind of things. So we created a series of experiments. We created a model collaboration space. We invited people to come in and use it. We saw how it worked for them. We iterated on it. We improved all of the things that didn't work. We then set out 3 model collaboration spaces. We saw how they worked together. We continued in this experimental nature. We did the half of the floor next, then we did the whole floor. And so it's about scaling up. One of the things that always worries me is when clients just want to kind of issue a brief and make the decisions in the pitch over who they're going to go with. That's not a good way of redesigning your office. Really what you want to do is you want to experiment your way towards success over a number of iterations rather than fit out a whole office in a big bang, because the risk there is massive that you don't get the improvements that you're hoping for. You can do this too. It's not expensive to do. You can do it relatively cheaply, relatively quickly. And the great thing about it being cheap and quick is that then you can iterate your experiments on a daily basis if you need to. You spot something that isn't working, you change the experiment, you improve it, you go into the next round of experimentation. So where you're creating spaces that your office needs that it hasn't had before, that's a great way of tuning those spaces, getting them right before you then kind of pull the lever and commission a whole heap of those different spaces. One of the most important things in that iterative prototyping, experimental approach is how you manage the kind of space experiments. You have to measure them almost exactly like you would if you were creating a new website. One of the great things about when you put up a new website is you can hook it up to Google Analytics and you can see everything that people do on that website, where they come from, how long they stay, when they leave, all of that kind of stuff. You can do that with physical space. It just requires a little bit more effort. So occupation studies are one of the ways that you can manage these prototypes. And what you do is you observe people actually using the space, look at how they're using that space, what are they doing, how they're using it tell us about future and present kind of space needs. And from those occupation studies, you get heat maps like this, exactly like you get for a website. So you can start to see, like, where are the successful areas in our design? You can see here where people are sitting just from the kind of red blobs of kind of activity. But you can tell things like how long people are staying, what they're using that space for. What you often find is you're surprised at the uses that people put space to. Shadowing, again, is a brilliant way to understand how people are using prototype spaces. Following people around the prototype space and understanding how they're using it is a really good way of understanding. And again, you don't have to know the questions you need the questions you want to ask in order to shadow someone and observe their experience. And exit interviews, when somebody's finished using those prototype spaces, ask them, how did you use the space? How did you find it? Would you invite your colleagues to use a similar space with you in the future? All of those kind of things can give you a really good indication of how those spaces are working. What we notice with work activities is that people will have a primary activity that they want to accomplish in a day, and that's typically, that takes up the largest part of their time. Not in all organisations, because meetings take up the largest part of people's time in some organisations, but they set a primary activity. I've got to write that report today, I've got to get that done, or I've got to plan this new project, whatever it is, but there'll be a primary activity that people want to get done. Then there'll be a bunch of secondary activities that support that primary activity. So that might be research about the report that they're writing. It might be collecting insights from the marketing team about customer behavior to go into the report. It might be about collecting people's budgets and things like that, whatever it is. But there'll be a bunch of secondary activities that feed into that primary activity. And then there's a bunch of tertiary activities that are not directly related to the work that they're doing, but supports their working life. So scheduling meetings, responding to email, all of the meetings that you get dragged into that are not about your work, but are about work in general. They're all tertiary activities. And one of the things that we notice in organisations is that tertiary activities take up more and more time. And at some points during lockdown, all people had time for was the tertiary activities. They had no time for the primary activities. So that can be one of these things that that drives this feeling that people have got too much work to do and not enough time to do it. The other thing that people often don't notice about space is that spaces have an intensity. You walk into some spaces and you instantly feel like you should be quiet in them. You walk into other spaces and they're buzzy and they feel like you should be chatting to someone. We call that intensity. And what you notice is that different offices, different parts of the office will have different levels of intensity. But you can engineer intensity. You can actually deliberately influence the intensity of spaces. Now, a high-intensity environment, people tend to stay for a long time. There's low movement through the space. Any movement that there is tends to disrupt people. It tends to be a very quiet environment. You tend to have the presence of kind of traditional kind of desks and chairs, that kind of layout. Usually, large open plan. It's the type of space where if you get a phone call, you feel like you have to go somewhere else to take the phone call, even though there's hundreds of people sitting in the same space. A medium intensity space, similar kind of physical characteristics, but usually smaller and more humanized. And so people feel like they can have a chat while they're working. They actually feel like you don't have to, when you're moving around, you're not bothering other people. And then, of course, you get the low-intensity environment, which feels much more relaxed. It might have sofas or soft furnishings. It feels like you'd want to spend a lot of time there. But the interesting thing about low-intensity environments is that people actually don't spend a lot of time in them. They tend to move through them. They tend to do something and move out of them again. Now, this is how the intensity of spaces and people's individual hierarchy of working activities intersect. And so what you'll generally find is that people will choose a higher intensity environment for their primary activity for the day compared to tertiary activities and reflection or breaks. That's the other thing. Offices need spaces where you can reflect, take a break, be inspired, and then go back to work. And you want to encourage people to move between these different modes of working and these different activities when it is right for them to do so from their point of view. And so you have to provide a range of working environments for people. Let me run through some of those working environments to give you kind of a kind of picture of what some of these spaces might look like. The first one is the kind of working need is shallow work. Open plan offices aren't all bad. They're very, very good for shallow work. And some organisations, shallow work is what takes up most of people's time. In other organisations, shallow work is very little of people's time. So these are the types of spaces that you might think of for shallow work. You know, and this is work that doesn't require too much concentration. It's work that you can kind of get on with and then have a quick chat to someone, ask them their opinion about something, get back to the work. And, you don't need kind of deep focus. You don't need deep concentration. When people get up and move around in the space or you overhear a conversation, it doesn't break your concentration. Those are all kind of the characteristics of shallow work. And you can see here that actually there's sight lines across the office. There's no kind of barriers to kind of block sight lines. You can see that it's kind of social working environment. Now, this is the root of the toxicity of open plan offices, though. The problem with an open plan office is that it assumes all work is shallow work. Now, that's okay if in your organisation all you want people to do in the office is shallow work. But actually, if people need to concentrate, if you've got an organisation where there's a high number of software engineers, or you've got an organisation where there's a high number of people doing complex accounting, or you're in an organisation where there's people reading detailed legal precedents, and writing contracts, then that might not be considered shallow work. What you might need to think about is deep work. And what you want for deep work is almost the opposite of shallow work. If I show you the spaces for deep work, you can see they're spaces that are cloistered. There's a relatively low number of people. You've got, your sight line is blocked in a lot of these kind of spaces for deep work, so that actually as somebody walks behind these booths, you're not worried about people walking behind. The interesting thing about an office like that is people will automatically route themselves behind that so that they don't interrupt people. And so when you create your spaces correctly, they nudge people into behaving in ways that kind of help them respect their colleagues' kind of need for concentration, for example. We worked with an organisation where there was a high degree of software engineers. And one of the problems we had when we came to do our design ethnography, we were supposed to be shadowing these software engineers, but we could never find them. We'd turn up at their desk. They were never there. And we'd ask their colleagues, oh, where's such and such? We're due to meet them here to shadow them today. And they'd go, don't know. The problem that we were having, although we didn't realise it at the time, is that software engineering organisation was engaged in an organisation-wide game of hide and seek. The only way that you could get work done in that, they had an interrupt culture. Basically, if you were sat at your desk, people would tap you on the shoulder and go, can you just, what's your opinion of this? Can you just help me with this a second? Have you done this? Even if you put your headphones on, which normally in any usual organisation means don't disturb me or disturb me and die, still wasn't respected. And so what people would do is they'd go and they'd actually swap desks with people. They'd organise desk swaps between themselves to go and work in areas where nobody knew them so that they didn't get interrupted in their work. That's an organisation that is fundamentally not set up for the work that happens there. You've got a high degree of software engineers. They're having to hide to get their software engineering done. That's not a good environment. And so, you can create these kinds of environments where actually they're there for deep work. Of course, when we think about returning to the office, we might decide that actually deep work is perfect work for at home. It might be the perfect kind of activity. But remember, if we're going to do that 3-2 rubbish, where we do 3 days in the office and 2 days at home, but what you're basically saying is you can only do deep work 2 days a week. Now, if your organisation only expects 40% of deep work, then that's kind of okay. But if you're a software organisation that's thinking that you're going to do this 3-2 thing, you might want to rethink that, unless you're going to create some spaces in the office to do deep work. And this is at the root of the problem of the organisation. If you've got a lot of people as well doing deep work, then a couple of booths to cover that deep work is not going to be enough. Now, actually, you really need to think about separating people. What we did with that organisation of software engineers is we made offices no bigger than 8 people. So we broke their office up into units of 8 people offices, so that each office there was enough people in it where they could sit and concentrate, and they could negotiate between themselves how quiet or not they wanted it. So that actually, if it was kind of lunchtime or heading towards lunchtime, there might be a little bit of chat. But at other times, you'd walk into these 8-person offices and they'd be deathly silent, and you'd have people there because they'd agreed between 8 people that they were all going to get some stuff done. And so what you find is that as you reduce the number of people who have to negotiate over a space, they can come to agreements between themselves about how they use the space. Open exchange is obviously really important. This is one of the benefits of the open plan office. And so we don't want to lose that. But one of the biggest problems we've ever witnessed in offices is the lack of meeting rooms. No organisation ever seemed to have enough meeting rooms before the pandemic. The reason for that is because of all the things happening in meeting rooms that didn't require a meeting room. Basically, any group of people who needed to discuss anything, their only choice was to book a meeting room and hold a meeting room. What you can do is obviously create spaces that are not meeting rooms to meet in. And all of a sudden, your meeting room problem evaporates. These booths are great because they feel private, but they're not that private that you can't kind of see what's going on in them. And so booths are hugely successful. Wherever you introduce booths into an office space, you quickly find that they're the most popular place in the office, because all those meetings that were taking place in meeting rooms that didn't need a meeting room because they're not confidential and they didn't need privacy suddenly start taking place in booths because the booth is nicer than the meeting room. Office spaces need places to be inspired and to allow for reflection and recharging. What we find so often is that people go into that primary activity. And ideally, what you want to create in an office is where people get into that flow state. If you ever worked on something and all of a sudden it's difficult, it's challenging, but actually as you get into it, the work seems to get easier and you just lose track of time. And all of a sudden you realize you've been sat in the same position for 2 or 3 hours, you haven't moved, but you've got a huge amount done. And that's the flow state. And ideally what we'd want to do is encourage people to get into that flow state to do deep work in offices. But at the end of that 3 hours, you realize you haven't moved and your feet have gone to sleep, or you realize how cold it is in your home office. That happens to me all the time. I kind of get out of that flow state and go, bloody hell, it's freezing in here. And so what you need at the end of that is a space to recharge. You can't do kind of hours of deep work and then not get up, walk away, do something different, even if it's to make a cup of tea. Information storage and retrieval is hugely important for office spaces. And one of the things that I think is really important to mention is that plants are really important to the health and well-being of a space. So there was a study published that showed that even looking at something green, not natural, but just a green piece of paper, a green card, improves people's sense of well-being and people's productivity. But there's 20 years ago, Wolverton led a study for NASA about the role of houseplants in purifying air. And what he found was that actually plants remove benzenes and formaldehyde and other chemicals that are routinely found in the chairs that you're sitting on, in the carpet that you're walking on, basically in all the things that an office space is built out of, and they have these chemicals in. And plants remove those. One of the best plants is a simple peace lily. I don't know whether these lilies are real, but certainly being cut and in water won't help, but having them grow, they take toxins out of the air. Last slide before I open up for questions is that you can actually measure the impact of improving physical space on the productivity of the people who work there. So here are two. One's a customer service team, one's a software engineering team. Now, think back to that Victorian office layout that we saw on the slide with all the pictures on. One of the things that hopefully now you kind of all realise is that the office for a software engineering company, team, should look very different to the office for a customer services team. Often they don't. But actually, when you design specifically for the jobs that people are going to do in those spaces, what you see is that the productivity soars. And so you can see here that by designing a space distinctly for customer services, you reduce the error rate. In this case, we reduced the error rate by 32%. We reduced sickness absence by 11%, and the average time to resolve a complaint by 63%. And that's just from improving the physical workplace that people are working in and how you apportion space to teams. When you look at the software engineers, you see a 47% increase in software engineer productivity and a 51% increase in code quality, as well as a 3% reduction in sickness absence. So people are better off when you design spaces for the jobs that they have to do. And I said that was my last slide, but it isn't. What I just want to say is we need to think in 3 dimensions, because the office isn't, I don't think that we have a binary choice between office and home. When we're thinking about the mix of where people are going to be working in future, social public spaces, third place as it's known in placemaking terms, is really important. So that could be the library, it could be a cafe, that has good Wi-Fi, but actually the commingling opportunities in social public spaces is really important and something that we should think about, because it actually supports local communities. If you have people, rather than tripping into the office in the centre of town, working in their local cafe, well, suddenly that local cafe has got more customers, which means that they're more likely to keep going and contributing to the local economy and all of those kind of things. The other thing I would say is the thing that's really important about this experimental approach that we take is that it allows for spaces to change over time. We shouldn't think of the workplace as something that we redesign every 5 years and that then stays static between redesigns. Actually, you want it to be constantly evolving as the organisations that you work for constantly evolve too. So, lots of things there, but what I'll do now is say, any questions? Yes, thank you. The back.
Sort of related to the office parts of what we do, but we also have laboratory space.
Yeah.
So we've got analytical chemists in a lab, and it's just wondering how much change we can have, because of the constraints of needing sinks, of needing glassware, food cupboards. So you're heading more to perhaps a factory environment, where you have a little workspace. An interesting challenge.
Yeah, it is an interesting challenge. We've designed spaces for scientists at the University of Cambridge, so it's a challenge that I'm familiar with. And of course, you can't create a lab in a suitcase. You perhaps can, but you wouldn't necessarily create a lab in a suitcase that people are going to carry around. There will be specialist kind of equipment that people need and a place that they go to use that specialist equipment. I think one of the things that comes out of this approach, though, is not expecting scientists to exist in that lab environment for 8 hours of the day, because actually what you notice is that their primary activity might be, conducting experiments, but actually that's not all that they do. They will also spend time reading journal articles and keeping up with the science. They'll spend time, trying to find journal articles that support the science that they're doing. They'll spend time trying to do research as to why the reaction that they're doing in the lab hasn't worked. And all of those things don't necessarily have to happen in the lab environment. And so one of the things to think about as you're redesigning those kind of specialist environments is what are all the tasks, the secondary and tertiary tasks that people do, and should we be making them do those in the space where we ask them to do their primary activity, which might be experiments. And the answer to that is usually no, because they're suboptimal environments. for those kind of secondary and tertiary activities. And so what you end up planning then is the lab space and all of the environments that you need around your lab space so that it makes it an effective environment for science. And an effective environment for science isn't just lab space. Does that make sense? Yeah. Perfect. Any other questions? Yeah, go on.
How have you chose to return then post-pandemic if 2 or 3 is not your time?
So, now, bearing in mind we're a design practice, so very different to a typical office environment. What we've decided to do is actually reduce all this. So, whereas before we had 2 studios, one of the studios was a smallish but reasonable size kind of open plan environment, meeting rooms and stuff. What we've actually decided to do is we've decided to create a small kind of drop-in space where there are hot desks for people who want to come in and work. Most of our people work really successfully remotely, but there's things that you do as a design practice that are just kind of quicker and easier if you get together. And so what we've created is a series of project rooms that actually sit around a central hub where there are drop-in desks. And so we've moved to a model where typically people will spend most of their time working from home, but where projects or clients want to get together, we've got space then that allows for that to happen. And so we flipped the model on its head completely from open plan to very closed kind of plan offices that are perfect sizes for things like ideation sessions, for crits, for all the things that we do as for bringing clients in and getting them involved in the work, all of those kind of things, which means that actually our desk footprint is really only for people who can't work from home. We've got a few people who, because their Wi-Fi is rubbish, because they don't have a spare room, you know, all of those kind of things, that we need a space where people can come in and kind of drop in and use a desk. And so, or the fact that they're here for a meeting, and you know, or they're here for one of those sessions that will use the project room and they want to kind of sit on a desk, or they just want to be around their colleagues, you know, that actually that's a good reason to kind of drop in, use a desk. We've got screens on every desk, and people will use that space. But the majority of space is given over to project rooms where kind of the work happens, as it were. Yeah.
Can I just ask, there's all the interesting stuff that I'm sure we're all grappling with, but there's also the cultural side of things, and people working together, social interaction, supervision, learning from people around you.
Yeah.
Have you done any research around that in terms of the impact of these different working areas and how you can maintain kind of culture around people?
Yeah, very much so. And one of the projects that we did was looking at the impact of hybrid working on onboarding, which is a point where people really do need the presence of their colleagues. And I'll actually, it's one of the slides I skipped over. But what you notice when you look at this is that actually it's partly that the software doesn't work for what people are trying to do, and partly that people do need to genuinely be in the same place. So what we've noticed is, for example, that it's easier than ever to connect with people. You know, you can have a meeting with anyone can get together in a meeting, but it's really hard to know when they're available, short of checking their calendar. And so everything has to be scheduled. There's no spontaneity anymore of dropping by somebody's desk, having a quick conversation, sorting it out in 10 minutes. What you'll do is you'll book a 30-minute meeting. And 30-minute meetings always take 30 minutes, even if the thing you've got to talk about only takes 10. It's one of the unpublished laws of meetings. And so, things like ambient availability and presence is really important. I don't think that we can, though, depend on people all being in the same space for that anymore. Actually, we have to ask questions of our software and how we use that software to be able to tell, are people online? Are they at work? Can I send them a message? And get communication out of email, But also, a lot of those things that could have happened spontaneously in the office could also happen asynchronously. Asynchronously is another form of spontaneity, albeit you perhaps don't get the answer exactly when you wanted it, but as the question asker, sometimes you're not the best person to judge how urgent that thing is to be responded to. I think we also see that good social interactions at work are really the difference between people thriving at work and surviving. But we find that actually where you delegate when people are going to be in the office to smaller decision-making units like a team, then the teams will themselves agree to be in the office at the same time. So, if your teams are between anywhere between 10 and 25 up to about 50 people, actually some of the teams will agree amongst themselves, do you know what, we're all going to come into the office on Wednesday, we're all going to work in the office on Wednesday. But that's them sorting it out, rather than the organisation pushing on them, thou shalt be in the office 3 days a week. And of course, all you're doing with that 3-2 model is guaranteeing that your office will be oversubscribed on a Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday and undersubscribed on a Monday and Friday, right? That's all you're doing there. And so you're not going to realise any of the benefits of moving to a 3-2 model. You might as well tell people to come back to the office 5 days a week from a cost point of view. You also need to try and maximise the ability for people to absorb ambient information, because that really disadvantages new starters. New starters can just sit in their team and absorb what other people are doing and kind of learn from watching them do it. How you replace that, you need to think really carefully about in this hybrid model, but I don't think that's a good excuse to drag people back to the office on a mandated 3 days a week, because that's not a solution to the problem, it's just a really bad coping kind of mechanism. And so those are the kind of issues that we've seen. But actually, one of the other things that we see is some organisations are not used to pulling work. They're used to pushing work to people. And therefore, the manager needs to be able to monitor when that work is complete so that they can push more work to people. If you can do the cultural flip of having people pull work, well, first of all, people feel more in control of their own workload, so they complain less about their workload. Their productivity actually goes up because they feel more connected to the work that they're actually doing. You free the manager up from basically synchronizing work to actually being able to get on with work of their own. And so one of the biggest cultural shifts you can make in an organization to solve some of these problems is the move from pushing work to people to having people pull work themselves. And moving to a culture of pulling work can be really transformative for organizations. Any other questions? No. Awesome. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming and listening. I hope that's been of interest and useful to you all. Thank you very much.